So, moving on just on to the last of the talks that we have is specifically on the 81 hunger strike. We have two speakers. Tommy McKearney, be well known to people. He's an ex-POW who was in the H blocks during the first and second hunger strikes and took part in the first hunger strike. And our second speaker is Stuart Ross, who has recently released a book called Smashing H Blocks, which is the story of the campaign outside of the prison. So between them, Tommy is going to give us the inside track on what his experience within the jail, and Stuart is going to give an account of the campaign outside, the Smash H Block campaign on the outside. We were to have a third speaker. Pádraig McKearney was to speak, but unfortunately he had to pull out at the last minute. Pádraig was also in the blocks during that period. Once the two lads have spoken, we're going to have questions and answers then, so if anyone, if there's anything that they raise or anything that they're interested in, rather than disrupting the speakers, they just make a note of it and people come in at the end. So before I hand over to them, the last thing I just point I want to make, I know it's been mentioned a couple of times already, just want to mention it again, is the fact that to note that the hunger strike is not something of 30 years ago, that earlier this week on Tuesday, a number of prisoners from the PFLP, that's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, commenced a hunger strike in opposition to Israeli occupation and the Israeli administration and the jail, the conditions under which they are being held. So I mean, this isn't ancient history, it's alive, it's happening at this point, albeit not in Ireland. There is a hunger strike underway as we speak. So in that context, Éirígí have organised a protest on outside the Israeli embassy at 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday coming, so everyone is welcome to come along to that and show their support for those PFLP hunger strikers. And on behalf of Éirígí, as the chairperson of the party, I want to extend our solidarity to them as they battle against Israeli aggression and imperialism. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Tommy McKearney.
Thank you, Brian, and I would like to begin by thanking Éirígí for inviting me here today. It's always a privilege and an honour to be invited to address this party and to participate in some of their events, particularly commemorating and examining the hunger strikes of 1981 and the enormous sacrifice made at that time by not just the 10 heroes that gave their lives, but by all of those who contributed both inside and outside. And from the outset, I'd like to associate myself with the sentiments expressed by the chairperson of Éirígí, Brian Leeson, sending greetings and support and solidarity to our comrades in the Popular Front on hunger strike at the moment in Palestine. I'd like to begin by saying that I think I'll attempt to cover and use two themes. One, because of what we're talking about, to give you some of my memories of not just the hunger strike, but of the protest itself, the blanket protest, which sometimes is, if not overlooked, but because of the magnitude of and significance of 10 men dying on hunger strike, that the lead up to it and the broad participation by approximately 400 Republicans in the prison, sometimes it tends to recede into the background. And secondly, I think there's a major lesson to be learned from that period in terms of the techniques and the tactics that were employed. And I'm not for a second suggesting that you can ever repeat what was done before, but certainly there are certain fundamental underlying messages. And in many ways, therefore, when I start here, I'm going to talk about my memories of the blocks themselves and those days on protest on the blanket. It was, I'm not sure whether you'll be pleased or not, or whether it's good or bad, but it was by and large the first place that I started to speak publicly. If you could describe speaking in jail as speaking publicly. And the one great advantage I had is that those that were listening couldn't get away. So, with that in mind, I'll be keeping an eye on the door for the next few minutes until at least I sit down. The conditions in the H blocks are certainly worth thinking about, in the sense that, as has been explained probably on a number of occasions today, were so difficult and so horrible in so many different ways. I remember when I was sentenced, it was just a few days before Christmas of 1978. Long nights, short days, dark, cold, just a few days, as I say, before Christmas. I come in from the van, prison van, that had taken me from Belfast Courthouse to the H blocks in Longkesh. I was brought to reception, as they call it in every prison, and invited to conform. And that was what they wanted, and that's what they asked me to do, to conform. To take off my own clothes, wear a prison uniform, and follow prison rules. The reason for that, the political reasoning behind that, has been very well documented and eloquently described to you by Brendan McKenna and others, I'm sure, today. But when I was brought to the reception, I refused to wear prison-issued clothing. I was then stripped, handed a towel, put in the van and taken to the blocks. And there I met the principal officer of that particular block and the class officer of the wing. The class officer in prison language is the prison officer, or as we always invariably call them, the screws, in charge of that particular wing. And the first thing they told me was that, to be under no illusions, that if I caused them any trouble, that they would be able to employ more force than I could even dream of. And I was very soon to find out that that was actually the truth. I haven't spent a year on remand. It come as no news to me, but certainly it was the case. And I was sent to the cell. When we went into the cell, because we refused to wear prison-issued clothing, we were deemed immediately to be in violation of prison regulations. Because we were not wearing prison clothing, therefore we were not allowed out of the cell to do prison work. Because we didn't do prison work, because we wouldn't wear clothes, we were therefore denied all privileges. Privileges in prison are not what privileges might appear to be on the outside. A privilege in prison is a newspaper, access to the radio, access to tobacco. All of that was denied. And there was a very definitive and calculated reason for doing all this, in an attempt to break people down. And on the cell door, all the time, was the cell card giving our name, our sentence, our age, and down at the bottom, the letters NCP, non-conforming prisoner. And that, for a number of years, was the legend at the bottom of all our cell cards, NCP, non-conforming prisoners. The first cell that I was put into, and this was very poignant for me over the last 12 months or so. First cell I was put into, on the protest, on the blanket, my cellmate was Brendan Lillis. And for that reason it struck me as remarkable that 30 years later Brendan Lillis was paying a price for being there 30 years ago. The protest had to an extent escalated by the time I was sentenced from where it had started with Kieran Nugent. And by that stage we were refusing to cooperate under any circumstances whatsoever with the regime. And I think this is where we're talking here about the emerging and developing tactics of people in prison. And I think the real lesson here is that when deprived of every other option. It's absolutely astonishing and astounding, the ingenuity of human beings to defy a system and to prevent a system working if they're prepared to do so. We didn't have a route map, we didn't have a plan, we didn't have a blueprint for what to do. But there was one underlying principle, that absolutely nothing that the authorities would do would provoke us into cooperating. It reached epic proportions at times. Because we were not clothed, what we had in our cell, we had 3 blankets, as prison issue blankets, the grey prison army blankets, you may know them as. Very seldom were there 3 blankets in good condition. Very often the 3 blankets were very, very threadbare. We had a sponge foam for a mattress, for one good reason, that previous to my conviction and being put into the protest and going on protest, the blanket men had smashed up all the furniture in their cells, smashed all the windows, put the windows and the glass out and the furniture out through the windows. Now, fine, we had no furniture as a result of that, but in the cell we had sponge mattress, 3 blankets. There is no in-cell sanitation, or there was no in-cell sanitation, so we had a chamber pot, 2 pint plastic mugs, and I suppose, if you like, an enduring tribute to the British penal system, 2 copies of the Gideon Bible. And the Gideon Bible, in fact, proved to be a very useful asset. I probably, for an atheist, are better acquainted with the King James Bible than many God-botherers who would follow the fashion would have, because with nothing else to read, I have went through the Old Testament on a number of occasions. But apart from that, there also we found it very useful for using as paper for cigarettes. The odd time we could write on it. We had a lot of uses for it. We found at one stage that there's a chink in the pipes that run from cell to cell, a small chink. We could push a piece of paper with it, we'd carry the Bible through and we'd send it through and we message through to the next cell. Sometimes we put a little bit of tobacco, if we could smuggle it through, put it into it, and a lot of ingenious techniques like that. What I'm coming round to is that in spite of very awful and appalling conditions, because we were confined to the cell 24 hours a day, we were entitled to 1 statutory visit per month, which in itself was anything but pleasurable, because we were subjected to all the tortures of a strip search that Mandy has explained to you. Forced into a search position, mouth search, anal search, mirror searches, and thereafter subjected to fairly crude abuse on our way to the visit and back. The reason we even accepted visits was to maintain contact, and we did so on a rota. Usually there was about 40 men on a wing, and we attempted as best we could to ensure that a visit a day went out so that we had minimum contact with the outside world. Apart from that, we had access to Mass once a week, which was very well attended by a lot of people who didn't actually subscribe to a hereafter, on the basis that it was our only opportunity to meet with each other and talk with each other on a week-to-week basis for the hour that Mass would last. But in spite of that, in spite of the fact that the prison authorities decided to diminish the food ration, not officially of course, because nothing ever happens officially within the British prison system if it's to the detriment of prison rules. It always happens unofficially. But what was a fairly meagre, mundane diet was in itself reduced by the authorities. We were confined to cell. We certainly had no comforts in terms of access to the media, to radios, to tobacco, anything like that. But in spite of that, morale was surprisingly good. Morale was surprisingly high through those years. And looking back now, for all the hardships we felt and all the brutality that we experienced, I can remember almost as many uplifting moments as I can remember moments of hardship. And just coming along the road this evening, I started to think back to the wing and the different names and the different faces and the different men I knew. And the attempt that was made on an ongoing basis to maintain morale and keep it high and keep the spirit there, and it was phenomenal. Amazing what happened in those years and the amount of ingenuity, sometimes to pass tobacco, on simple reasons, to pass tobacco around. And it's amazing what you can do without a cigarette lighter, without anything like that. We were able to smuggle in minor amounts of tobacco. Sometimes, in fairness, the priest who would say Mass would bring us in some tobacco. I've been quite critical of the clergy all my life, or certainly since I was a teenager, but yeah, they brought it in. The late Father Fall, who I think has had a bad press from Republicans, but the late Father Fall regularly brought us in tobacco. On one occasion, the Cardinal himself brought us in a very considerable amount of tobacco, Cardinal Thomas O'Fee. And Thomas O'Fee brought the tobacco in. I just can't imagine how he found enough pockets and spots, because he had it in his socks. That's right, yeah, he had a good big pair of woolly socks and he had tobacco stuffed down his socks. He had them inside his shoes, he had them inside his pockets, and handed them out as he went from cell to cell. A terrible violation of prison rules and the trust that Her Majesty's government had placed in him as a man of God, but he brought them into his fair play. And of course we broke the cigarettes up and sprinkled a little tobacco out and used the good book to contain the tobacco. But to light a cigarette, as you know, you have to have a match or a lighter. And the ingenuity that I found there was astonishing. All we needed was a small piece of the inside of the pen, where the ink goes down, small, about 2 inches, and the flint from a lighter, and the wheel of a lighter. That's all was needed, and that will give you a spark. And thereafter, you use a piece of thread, fray it down into cotton wool, and throw the spark, and off it goes. And that was for years how the little amount of tobacco and the few cigarettes we smoked. Incredibly damaging to the lungs. I can't recommend it, that's for sure. Ink and Bible and second-hand tobacco. Cigarettes aren't good at the best of times, but I can tell you the cigarettes we smoked there were lethal. But that was done on a regular basis. I'm just using that to illustrate the nature of the resilience and the spirit that existed there. Getting a smoke become almost a triumph in itself to overcome the system. We also then went into other methods and means of holding the place together. There's the stories I'm sure you've heard of men standing at the door. And this is where I first found an audience, as I've said. We would stand behind the prison door because we couldn't get out. And men would stand behind a prison door and use their voice, project their voice right across a wing of 40 men to tell a story. And sometimes somebody would repeat a book that they had read or a film they had seen. My forte, of course, was to maintain morale by projecting my interpretation of Irish history. Needless to say, the British and the Black and Tans and the Free State didn't get the best press, but I have to say this, it went down well. And later, as time went by and we got off the protest, and men came back to me and questioned and queried and challenged some of the facts and some of the interpretations, I had to say, well, I didn't have the books with me to give you the exact story, but by and large the trend was right. I still have a grudge against the Black and Tans, the Free State and the British government. That hasn't changed, at least that much is consistent. But that actually lasted and survived. That was the spirit that took us through those years. Because we didn't have a blueprint, we'd done everything we possibly could to avoid a hunger strike. People will ask me, why did you do this? Why did you do that? We tried every possible means to avoid a hunger strike, and for that, I will always give enormous credit to the two men that done everything they possibly could, Brendan Hughes, Tom McFeely, and their staff. Eventually we realised that there was going to be no breakthrough. We were at a situation where we either had to contemplate conceding, because we knew we couldn't sustain that level of protest indefinitely. We knew we were going to have to concede the protest or go on hunger strike. And that's when we called the hunger strike. The first hunger strike ended in dispute. We went through into the second hunger strike, and the second hunger strike began with Bobby Sands on the 1st of March 1981. And I remember some of the things that we always talked about, and one phrase that Bobby used very, very often, a quotation from Tom Clark's prison writings, where Tom Clark said in his writings, Tom Clark wrote a very small pamphlet about the 15 years he spent in prison, but one thing he said was that there is no weapon in the Empire's arsenal to break a Republican who chooses not to be broken. And Bobby repeated that many, many times. And I remember that emerging in the last days before that first and second hunger strike, when Bobby quoted that several times. The hunger strike itself, the second hunger strike, in some ways I found almost more difficult than the first hunger strike which I participated in. Because then it was only a battle with my own body. The second time round, it was a very, very difficult situation because it was an emotional battle, knowing that men that I knew very well, for the most of them I did, were dying, and dying slowly over a protracted period of time. And it's one of the awfulest things you can experience, because I've lost many, many comrades, but most of them died rapidly in battle. And that, somehow or another, comes quick, sudden and desperately. But to see and know that a comrade is dying slowly and there's nothing can be done short of the enemy conceding is one of the most awful experiences that you can endure. The fact that most of the men were young and healthy, they all were under 30, with the exception of Frank Hughes. Frank was not in the best of health because when he was captured, Frank had been shot several times and was suffering. His body simply hadn't recovered. But a hunger strike actually is a very Darwinian process, because the bigger, younger, fitter the body is, it is a very, very ruthless process in that sense. Now, it's nothing got to do with fat, but the bigger, the more powerful, healthier body lasts, the longer. And that was one of the reasons why so many of those young men lasted so long, because they were fit, young, healthy. And the body is, without a human being and a human body, is without doubt just about the most sophisticated piece of equipment imaginable. We talk about computers and spaceships, talk about what you like. There is nothing as sophisticated as a human body. And the human body will take over in the absence of food and starts to protect itself, first giving away the least essential parts of the body. First goes the fat. And most of the men on that hunger strike were not overweight. It then attacks and takes away the muscle. It then goes through the organs until eventually it will take away the heart and head and brain, the last two vital organs, and it actually goes in that slow process till at the end, where the body starts to give way, where all the vital organs, the liver, the heart, the lung, can't pump the blood around the body. The man dies, or woman dies for that matter, but in this case we're talking about 10 young men died at the last stages in a coma. Prior to that, in incredible pain for many of those days, and that was their experience towards the end. And the authorities showed very, very little compassion. Very little compassion. I still remember the story of the death of Tom McKearney. Tom's brother Benny was on the same wing with him as Tom McKearney, cousin of Francie Hughes. And they denied Benny, who was arrested with Tom, was in the wing with Tom, they denied Benny a visit to his brother until the last. And they sent Benny down, and they opened the cell door and let him in. And when they let him in, Tom was dead. The hunger strike ended, and within a period of a year, as Brendan has outlined, many of the issues that we had raised had been conceded. A very cynical piece of work. The British knew that it was better then to concede post a hunger strike. Because actually within a matter of weeks we had our own clothes. Some of the remission was back, or remission didn't actually apply in my case. But much of what we had asked for came in the first few weeks from Jim Pryor, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Within a year or two, many of the rest. The battle actually was won in different ways. A large part of the battle for political status, because bear in mind, political status is nothing necessarily got to do with the conditions within the prison. They were summarised in a series of conditions, but at the end of the day, political status is something different from the conditions experienced within the prison. It was the recognition by the people that our struggle was political, not whether we had an extra parcel or 2 visits. It was the recognition by our people that we were fighting a political campaign. And that was granted to us not by the British authorities, not by the prison authorities, but by the good Republican people of Ireland when we voted Bobby Sands as a political prisoner, when we voted Kieran Doherty, Paddy Eye and the rest, when the world attended the funerals, when the world said, yes, you're fighting a political struggle. That's the battle we won, and that's how we won it at a terrible price. Before I step down, 30 years on, and we're looking at a situation where some things have changed, but some things haven't. The Prison Officers Association has essentially not changed. And in many ways, what's happening today in the northern prisons can be laid at the door of the Prison Officers Association, the POA. But ultimately, they are paid, directed, and under the control of the British sovereign government, because whether we like it or not, and certainly none of us here I'm sure do, London is the sovereign authority in the 6 counties, with their authority devolved through the devolution of policing and justice to an agreed Minister for Justice, and put that in apostrophes, the word justice for sure, agreed by both the DUP and Sinn Féin. So what David Ford does, and what he supervises and what he implements, has been agreed to by those that demanded the devolution of policing and justice. And here today we're seeing the mistreatment of prisoners, and we're also experiencing the cancellation, the revoking of prison licences. And a licence, bear in mind, for a life-serving prisoner is until he or she dies. In Ryan Price's case, until she dies. A life-sentenced prisoner is not technically ever at the end of his or her sentence. Technically, someone's sentenced to life, unless the sentence is quashed. But someone sentenced to life is only released on licence to serve the remainder of his or her sentence in the community. That's the definition of it. So for that reason, it does not require by law any legal process to cancel a licence of a life sentenced prisoner. So 30 years later, what is it now? 13 years after the Good Friday Agreement, with all the hoo-ha and brouhaha about it, that situation hasn't changed. Marion's licence has been cancelled. Marion Price is in prison on the basis of what happened 40 years ago. The same happened with Brendan Lillis, the same happened with, and can happen to any other prisoner in that situation. Another incident that was mentioned earlier this afternoon is the condition of Jerry McGill. Jerry was not sentenced to life imprisonment. He was sentenced for an incident that happened in 1981. Now, either this conflict is over or it's not. And it looks very much as if it's not. Because if you took a look at the summing up by the judge on McGill's case, the judge used two words among many. But he described Jerry McGill both as a criminal and as a terrorist. So 30 years later, the judiciary of Northern Ireland, supervised as a result of the devolution of policing and justice, has awarded a man who fought through that campaign the title of criminal and terrorist. He was brought to prison by the police force that has been authorised and endorsed under the devolution of policing and justice. So there are many questions we must ask ourselves about the progress that has been made in 30 years. Some changes have come about. Some things are not all for the good. There are also many human rights issues, and I heard one of the speakers from the floor talking and asking about human rights, and I am coming to a close now. We are not only looking in the 6 counties at a prison problem, dire as it is. There is a grave absence of human rights. We have non-jury trials. One judge, non-jury trials. I mean, there are non-jury trials in the Republic, but that doesn't justify non-jury trials in the North. We have indefinite sentences in the North. There's a young Armagh man in prison at the moment, sentenced to 5 years plus indefinite detention. So when he has his 5 years served, the judiciary can then say, yes, you haven't complied with all the conditions and we can keep you there for as long as we wish. That type of punishment would have shamed Louis XVIII. That's the type of judiciary and judicial system that pertains in the North. Things in other ways haven't greatly changed in terms of the absence of human rights. Bear in mind that it's not confined to those 6 counties, that there's a dearth of human rights throughout the United Kingdom. There are others in prison, and it's useful to think at this point in time of our comrades in the Popular Front, because there are Muslim prisoners in England at the moment suffering internment without trial. So there is a grave absence, and I think we should also then look, when we're looking at the dearth of human rights in the 6 counties, that we should also look to what's happening in Britain as well, because there are others suffering these setbacks, and it would be well worth our while to consider what support we can give to those on a wider base than here. So I'm going to conclude. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for coming here and being so patient through that long talk.